In the previous videos, we briefly covered the basics of HTTP. Now let's take a closer look. If you remember from the previous examples, HTTP is a request-response protocol where the server sends a request using a method and the server sends a response. These request and response messages are called HTTP messages. And HTTP messages all have the same common characteristics. They are made up of three parts. The first part is called the start line. There are some headers for both requests and responses, and you have a body which contains the actual data for the request or the response. The start line is the request and response parameters, which defines if a message is request or response, and certain common parameters for both. The headers contain the meta information, which is necessary for the request and the response, and the body contains the actual data that is transferred between the server and the client, and in many requests this is optional and is not available. Now let's focus on the start line for a moment. For a request, the start line has three parts: the name of the method, which is the action that is performed, the URL where the data is available or to be created, and the HTTP version. For a response, also you have three parts. The start line first contains the HTTP version. It's important to note that the request and the response must have the same HTTP version to prevent inconsistent behavior. The second field is the status code, as we saw before, which is a 3-digit number followed by a reason phrase. A reason phrase is just a string that explains the status code. Now let's look at a few examples. We go back to our basic walkthrough example and the user trying to do a GET request on a server. In this case, the start line consists of the method that is GET, the URL, which is users Alice, and the HTTP version. For an arbitrary example, we're just going to take HTTP2. And there are also some request headers, and there is no body because you're trying to get some data from the server. Now the response is a negative response, as we saw in the previous example, because the data doesn't exist already. And in this case, for the response, the server sends the start line with the HTTP version. As I told before, this should match the request. The response also contains 404, which is the status code, and the phrase is not found, which explains the status code, and there are some headers, optionally. The next request is the post request, where the client tries to create some data on the server. Now let's see what happens here in the request. In this request, the start line consists once again of the method, which is post, which is used to usually create data. The URL is the same and the version is the same. There are some headers to create this data, and here you have some body which contains the data which gets created on the server. And the server creates this data and you get a 201 response. And internally, once again, the HTTP version is the same. The status code is 201 and the reason phrase says that the item was created. There are some headers, and as you can see, there is no body in the response. Now, since the user is created, we can walk through the example and do a GET. This GET request is the exact same as the previous GET request, with the fields are the same. And the response in this case has a body because the user was created and now that information is returned on this response. And now if we look inside this response, you have the headers and the body. The rest of the response remains the same from the previous GET requests. You can imagine the same steps for put and delete. The start line consists of the method and some parameters. Headers are dependent on the request and the response, and body is sometimes available if it makes sense or it doesn't. So for example, if the client wants to send data, there's a body. If the server wants to send data, there's a body. Otherwise, there is no body. So just to summarize, the HTTP message consists of three parts: the start line, the headers, and the body. The start line consists of some information for request and response. The headers contain some additional metadata, and the body is the actual optional body based on the type of the request. And for responses, there are certain fields the HTTP version should match, the status code, and the reason phrase.